Amnesty International says world leaders, including U.S. President Donald Trump, are creating a more divided world. A U.S. Africa policy expert says the United States tops the list as Africa's largest trading partner, both in volume and quality. And health experts say heart disease is the #1 cause of death in sub-Saharan Africa for adults over the age of 30. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Vincent Makori. This is Africa 54. The human rights group Amnesty International says political leaders around the world, including U.S. President Donald Trump, are creating a more divided and dangerous world with toxic rhetoric. In the London-based organization's annual report on human rights worldwide, politicians in the United States, Europe and elsewhere are accused of creating an us versus them environment that weakens the defense of human rights. VOA's Greg Flakers reports from Washington.
Amnesty's annual report covers conditions in 159 countries, focusing on such problems as the ongoing civil war in Syria and the subsequent refugee crisis, as well as official restrictions of citizens' rights in countries ranging from Turkey to Cuba to the Philippines. The report, titled "The State of the World's Human Rights," says politicians in various nations have answered legitimate economic and security fears with poisonous and divisive identity politics. Adote Akwe of Amnesty International USA says smaller countries often follow the rhetoric and policies of political leaders in large nations like the United States.
Not only is the rhetoric dangerous, but also the practice or the implementation of the policies also becomes a model for other governments to follow.
Akwe says refugees face a backlash in Europe as well as the United States, driven by fears of terrorism that are unreasonable. He also says restrictions and bans placed on immigration by individual countries undermine the international system for refugee assistance established by treaties and conventions.
Those are at risk of being completely undermined, and once that happens, the base of how people should be treated at a minimum is suddenly gone.
Amnesty International's report also expresses concern that countries that have championed human rights in the past may be turning a blind eye to atrocities and may backtrack on their commitments as they themselves become more restrictive. Greg Flakes, VOA News, Washington.
Well, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres says more than $4 billion is needed by the end of March to help nearly 20 million people who risk starvation in Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan and Yemen. Citing armed conflicts and climate change as part of the reasons for the food emergency, Guterres led a call on Wednesday for $5.6 billion in funding for humanitarian operations in the 4 countries this year, of which $4.4 billion are needed by the end of next month to avert a catastrophe.
Famine is already a reality in parts of South Sudan. Unless we act now, it is only a matter of time until it affects other areas and other countries. We are facing a tragedy. We must avoid it becoming a catastrophe. This is preventable if the international community takes decisive action.
Well, the UN chief says women and girls are disproportionately affected by the crisis, and nearly 500,000 children are suffering severe acute malnutrition. South Africa's mobile operator MTN Group says it is concerned over the violence against its property in Nigeria, where protesters attacked and vandalized its head office. The attack was an apparent retaliation for anti-Nigerian violence in South Africa. This week, at least 20 shops believed to belong to immigrants were looted in South Africa's capital, Pretoria, although police refused to say if the attackers were specifically targeting foreigners. Anti-immigrant violence flares up sporadically in South Africa, fueled by persistent 26% unemployment and a belief that our African foreigners, some of them illegal immigrants, are taking jobs from locals. Now, the U.S. federal government has rescinded guidelines allowing transgender students to use bathrooms and locker rooms matching their gender identities rather than the gender listed on their birth certificate. The Department of Justice and Education issued a joint letter Wednesday to the nation's schools overruling a directive issued last year under President Barack Obama's administration. The letter says it must be up to state and local education departments to make that type of decision, not the federal government. Transgender rights advocates staged a protest in front of the White House Wednesday night, hours after the decision was announced.
Children all over the country are scared by this ban. They are really worried that they're going to go to school tomorrow, they're going to be bullied. These are kids who have to go to school all the time worried about being bullied by other kids, being bullied sometimes even by educators. And now they have to worry about the Attorney General of the United States and the President of the United States bullying them. It's just not okay.
Well, the Obama-era directive was based on law known as Title IX, arguing that its prohibitions against sex discrimination in education extend to gender identity. Last year's directive came amid a battle in the state of North Carolina, which enacted a state law saying people have to use public bathrooms that correspond to the gender listed on their birth certificate. In his first month in office, U.S. President Donald Trump has excited supporters and angered his critics, a continuation of last year's presidential election campaign that polarized the country. The president is taking great care to make sure that his core supporters are pleased with the early weeks of his presidency, an approach that some analysts say could create problems down the line. VOA national correspondent Jim Malone reports.
The arrival of Air Force One thrills Trump supporters in Florida as the president holds his first campaign-style rally as commander-in-chief.
Thank you, everybody.
After a busy and at times chaotic first month in office, Trump was eager to reconnect with his political base.
This was a truly great movement. And I want to be here with you, and I will always be with you. I promise you that.
Trump supporter Gene Huber was called to the stage, eager to thank the president.
When President Trump, during their election, promised all these things that he was going to do for us, I knew he was going to do this for us.
Polls show Trump is a divisive figure, but his political base is happy, says Republican strategist John Feary.
His most ardent supporters are delighted with what Donald Trump's been doing because he's basically taking the status quo and throwing it on the ground and smashing it up.
Trump opponents have also been out in force, holding rallies across the country, including Florida.
His agenda has been divisive, amoral.
Trump's controversial start in office has fueled a spirited opposition, says analyst James Thurber.
That's another unintended consequence of his actions, is that he's mobilized people, and these organizations are gaining in numbers. New organizations are being created.
During a tour of the new National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, Trump pledged to work for unity.
And that's what it's going to be. We're going to bring this country together, maybe bring some of the world together.
Trump's desire to cater to his core supporters could be politically risky over time, says John Feary.
I think he is, in many ways, failing, though, in trying to expand that base. And he's got to figure out, okay, how do I do things that can make the rest of the country comfortable in my leadership?
Trump's approval rating hovers around 40% in most polls, another indication that the president has work to do before he can broaden his base of support. Jim Malone, VOA News, Washington.
Well, economists say one important way of supporting African economic growth is through increasing African engagement with the international economy. For perspective on the volume and quality of U.S.-Africa trade, here's part two of my conversation with J. Peter Pham, Vice President and Director, Africa Center, Atlantic Council. First, I asked him what has been achieved by the African Growth and Opportunity Act, the U.S. Trade Act that is meant to significantly enhance market access to America for qualifying sub-Saharan African countries.
AGOA has achieved a great deal of success. It has raised by several-fold, depending on the individual country, the level of trade between Africa and the United States. So insofar as it was meant to increase trade, increase investment, it has succeeded. And it has created hundreds of thousands, if not millions of jobs in Africa, but also by statistics from the U.S. government, over 120,000 jobs related to AGOA directly attributable here in the United States. So it's also created American jobs. So it's been a win-win. However, for it to be sustainable over the long term, the next thing is the next AGOA.
Do you see a kind of a place for revision of the program to perhaps make it better, expand it?
I think certainly it has to be changed into a bilateral. It has to go both ways, not only opening the U.S. market for African products, but also opening African markets to U.S. products and intellectual protection. Already our European allies and partners are already talking. Earlier in January, the German government, for example, has raised the possibility of a Mediterranean Union, which will allow Egypt and the 4 North African countries to have access to the European Union internal market, with a goal to eventually be having a free trade zone with all of Africa. Currently, the only country in all of Africa that the United States has a free trade agreement with is Morocco. And we've seen that create tens of thousands of jobs in Morocco, and also thousands of jobs in the United States, in states large and small, as a result of the trade between the two. Now we need to figure a way to do this in a measured way with the entire African continent.
And staying with AGOA, some have said that the program has benefited mostly oil-producing companies or petroleum kind of products, but not like apparel in other fields also that would be of greater benefit to the general population.
Well, that certainly at the beginning, one looks at the consolidated data. Yes, the hydrocarbons and other extractives have predominated, but a lot of that was in the early years of the program, also at times when the prices for those commodities were very high. Increasingly now we're also seeing AGOA cover tens of thousands of other items, including light manufactured goods, fast-moving consumer goods, and others increasingly. So I think one has to wait to let it play itself out, but I think it's going to cover over time, once we get the complete data sets, far more.
And now you did mention that actually the only country that has this direct kind of trade deal with the United States is Morocco. Many look at the U.S. and wonder why it's not engaging more as compared to China. China seems to be trading and engaging with almost every African country without any trouble. Do you think perhaps the U.S. needs to kind of start dropping the demands for certain social and political changes in African countries that want to trade with it?
Vincent, I think we need to disaggregate a few things. First of all, China's volume of trade with Africa has certainly grown enormously in recent years. And in fact, since 2009, China has become Africa's largest trading partner in terms of bilateral volume of trade. But what's interesting has been that volume of trade has largely been one way, shipping out of primary resources without the value added to fuel China's own rise as an economic power, and then the shipment of, shall we say, relatively cheap manufactured goods to Africa. In some cases flooding the African market and competing with local manufacturing. But what's interesting has been that China's investment, when we talk about foreign direct investment, not loans, not road constructions tied to credit, et cetera, but actual investment, putting your own money where your mouth is, putting it at risk. China is a very distant fourth. It's the United States, Great Britain, and France who are the leaders in putting money in Africa, investing in business in Africa, running risks, but also building African economies from within.
Well, tomorrow I'll have part 3 of my interview with J. Peter Pham, looking at the differences between the U.S. engagement in Africa and that of China. Now, Kenya wildlife officials have conducted an annual area survey of elephants and other large animals within Tsavo National Park. The survey, dubbed the Tsavo Mkomazi County, covers 48,000 square kilometers of land across the Tsavo East and West National Parks in Kenya and Mkomazi in Tanzania. Once the results are compiled, the Kenya Wildlife Services will have a better idea of how many large mammals live in and around the ecosystem, one of the world's most important rangelands and elephant sanctuaries. Well, we want to know what you think about Africa 54, the stories we covered during the conversation on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. We're also streaming our show live on Facebook, so check us out and share our show with your friends. And check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Find me on Twitter at VOA Vincent Makori. Coming up, health experts say heart disease is the #1 cause of death in sub-Saharan Africa for adults over age of 30. Stay with us.
I'm Milar Sega. I'm the host of VOA's The Correspondents, a roundup of the world's top stories with analysis from our dedicated reporters. It's really a conversation the same way that you would bring a friend to your home and ask them what's going on. And our correspondents will do that and answer those questions through their own eyes.
That appears a false choice in more ways than one.
We can't actually put you there, but we can come pretty close. In 30 minutes, we'll show you the world.
Welcome back. It's time for our health report, and joining us now is Africa 54 health correspondent Lino Mudu with a look at cardiovascular disease. Lino.
The World Health Organization says 17.5 million people die each year from cardiovascular disease, and 75% of the deaths occur in low-income and middle-income countries. Cardiovascular disease is caused by disorders of the heart and blood vessels and includes heart attacks, stroke, and hypertension, rheumatic heart disease, and congenital heart disease. According to the WHO, the major causes of the disease are tobacco use, physical inactivity, and unhealthy diet and harmful use of alcohol. Health experts say cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of death in sub-Saharan Africa in adults over the age of 30. They say one of the strongest drivers is undiagnosed and untreated hypertension, which affects nearly 1 in 2 Africans over the age of 25, the highest rate of any continent in the world. Joining us live via Skype for more on the subject is Mrs. Elizabeth Gatumia. She's joining us from Kenya, Nairobi. She's CEO of the Kenyan Heart National Foundation. Mrs. Gatumia, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Glad to be with you this evening.
It's good to have you.
Kenya.
It's good to have you joining us all the way from Nairobi. Listen, can you give us a sense of the scope of the problem of heart disease in Kenya?
It's big. We must say that, like you have rightly said, I heard your brief there. It is becoming a real concern in our country. But as you would know, our biggest challenge in our country is that we lack proper data. Most of the data that is used is based on isolated research activities that are done by different individuals or groups. Like, for instance, Kenyan Heart has done its own research, particularly on rheumatic heart disease, which is a disease that affects children. And we found that at least 6 children, between 6 and 10 children die of rheumatic heart disease out of 1,000 children. And that's a very, very remote baseline survey that we did. And so, yes, indeed, from what we hear from the hospitals, people dying suddenly from stroke, from heart attack, due to undiagnosed hypertension, or even lack of follow-up of those who have been diagnosed with hypertension and don't follow up with the medication, which is supposed to be for life. And so it is true. Again, with affluent, the people who are well-to-do in Kenya, obesity is also becoming a challenge. I know in America it's a big-time one.
Yes.
It is becoming a challenge here because, you see, after colonization, I guess we tried to take on board all those things that probably had become a challenge to the so-called now developed world.
So let me ask you this. Let me ask you this quickly, because your organization focuses on addressing heart disease through awareness and education. How do you do that, and do you focus on a specific population?
Yes, we do. In Kenyan Heart, we concentrate a lot more on children. We believe we can make a lot of difference, a big difference, if we start educating the children from very early, from as early as class 3, that is from 9 years and above. If we teach them good feeding habits, that it's not just about eating fries and mandazis that we cook here in Kenya, and other fatty foods, that it is a good habit to be eating vegetables and fruits, and eating balanced meals. That's what we teach them. And we actually, at Kenyan Heart, encourage kitchen gardens in every school. We establish kitchen gardens ourselves. We go there, give them the plants. We give them the fertilizers. We cultivate for them. And we also have what we call Kenyan Heart talking walls in their schools.
Okay, Mrs. Gatumia, we have to leave it there, unfortunately. Thank you so much. We'll pick it up another day. Thank you for joining us.
All right, then. Thank you. That was pretty sharp, though.
That was Elizabeth Gatumia, CEO of the Kenyan Heart National Foundation. We continue to look at heart disease in our Ask the Expert segment today. The first National Heart Valve Disease Awareness Day here in the United States was commemorated on Wednesday. Susan Peschin, President and CEO of the Alliance for Aging Research, elaborates on what is heart valve disease.
Well, the heart has 4 valves, and heart valve disease is when you have damage to one or more of those 4 valves. The heart's valves are responsible for pumping blood in and out of the heart. And when that's not working properly, you can develop heart valve disease that sometimes can not be that serious, but other times can be very serious and result in complications, even including death. Some people don't have any symptoms with heart valve disease, which is one of the reasons why we encourage folks to get their heart checked regularly by their doctors. But folks who do have symptoms of heart valve disease might experience shortness of breath, fatigue, dizziness, even fainting, and generally just feel sort of out of sorts. Sometimes heart valve disease can be picked up by a doctor listening to your heart with a stethoscope and hearing a murmur. Heart valve disease affects folks at very early ages. Some people are born with heart valve disease, and that's called congenital heart valve disease. And it also tends to affect the very old. So people age 75 and older, as many as 1 in 8 have moderate to severe heart valve disease. Also, people who have had a previous heart condition are at high risk of developing heart valve disease, and people who have high risk for cardiovascular disease in general. So if you have high blood pressure or diabetes, you're also at a higher risk of heart valve disease.
And that was Susan Peschin with the Alliance for Aging Research discussing the heart valve disease. If you have a medical question that you would like to have answered, well, tweet me at Linor Moudou, and we'll have a medical expert respond to your query. That's our health report for today. Back to you, Vincent.
Well, Linor, very useful there. Thank you very much. Now be sure to watch Linor Moudou's health reports every Tuesday and Thursday right here on Africa 54. It's time now for a short break. Still to come on Africa 54. Ethiopian Airlines leads the way as one of Africa's most profitable air carriers. We'll be right back.
Hamilton Live is a live audience performance. With live music, you have that interaction. There's nothing like getting that immediate feedback from the folks that you're performing to. They feel it and they respond back to you. You see it in their eyes. You know that you're connecting with them. Like if any form of communication, it's that response that you get back.
Welcome back. Now, Ethiopian Airlines is one of Africa's most profitable air carriers, reporting an increase in revenues over its last fiscal quarter. However, the airline was unable to repatriate about $220 million held in local currency in Nigeria, Egypt, and some other African countries because of foreign exchange shortages in those countries. VOA's Paul Ndiho has more.
Africa's Ethiopian Airlines is a profitable carrier in a troubled industry, but it has been experiencing steady growth. Ethiopian Airlines revenue rose 10.3%, about 2.4 billion in the 2015/16 fiscal year, while passenger numbers climbed 18% to 7.6 million, and net profit was up to 70%. The state-owned carrier is Sub-Saharan Africa's biggest by revenue and has been rapidly expanding in its bid to become a global player through its increasingly crowded hub in Addis Ababa. The carrier wants to increase revenues to 10 billion by 2025 and expand its fleet to 140 aircraft from less than 90 now, with sights on Asia, but the airline still faced some challenges, particularly in African states where foreign exchange shortages meant it could not repatriate earnings held in local currencies.
Today, among these four countries, between Nigeria, Angola, Sudan, and Egypt, we have $220 million worth of local currencies, whether it is in Naira in Nigeria, or Kwanza in Angola, or the Egyptian pound, or the Sudanese pound, because there is severe shortage of foreign currency, foreign exchange, so we are not able to take whatever we sold. So it is stuck there. It has been trapped for more than 2 years, and it is subject to devaluation, and this is a huge challenge for us and for the other African countries.
Gabriel Mariam also added that the issue undermined the benefits of an oil price drop during the 2015/16 fiscal year. The falling oil prices in the period also undermined business from those African nations. With the addition of the Boeing 787-8 Dreamliners and Airbus 350 planes to its fleet, Ethiopian Airlines, a state-owned carrier, will be stiff competition for the other carriers, including South African Airlines and Kenya Airways. In addition to adding routes to China, Ethiopian Airlines is also considering adding Jakarta and Singapore to its destinations this year. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
Well, that's our show for today. Now be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com for more news. Tune in to VOA's evening radio show, Africa News Tonight, at 1800 UTC. And in the mornings to Daybreak Africa between 0300 and 0600 UTC, Monday to Friday. Thanks a lot for watching from all of us in Washington. Have a good night.
Welcome to English in a Minute. A single is one of something, and a double is two of something. But what does it mean when a person says,
on the double? I thought I'd set my alarm clock, but I didn't hear it ring.
Oh no, and Ashley's birthday party is going to start in a few minutes.
I better get there on the double before everyone eats all the birthday cake.
You and cake. Let's not forget whose birthday it is.
The phrase on the double means to do something very quickly. The expression comes from the military. When troops march double time, they move twice as fast as normal. And that's English in a Minute.